What would you do if you discovered that the family you'd been supporting for years had been lying to you all along? Margaret Chen was 50 years old when she found herself facing this exact question. For 8 years after her husband's death, she'd given everything to his family: her money, her time, her loyalty. She paid for her brother-in-law's medical treatments, covered her niece's college tuition, and even bought her mother-in-law a new house. Everyone praised her as the perfect daughter-in-law, the woman who honored her late husband's memory by caring for those he loved. But on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a single phone call would shatter everything she believed. The truth that slipped out would not only break her heart, it would reveal a web of deception so cruel, so calculated, that it would change her life forever. Margaret stood in her kitchen, staring at the bill in her hand. $23,000 for her mother-in-law's home renovation. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The money would come from her savings again, just like it always did. Just like it had for the past 8 years. Her husband, David, had died suddenly when she was 42. A heart attack at his desk. No warning, no goodbye. One moment he was there, kissing her forehead before heading to work. The next moment, he was gone. The grief had nearly destroyed her, but his family had rallied around her, and she'd found comfort in their presence. David's mother, Elizabeth, had held her hand at the funeral. His younger brother, Marcus, had helped her sort through David's belongings. His sister, Patricia, had called her every single day for months. "We're your family now," Elizabeth had whispered to her at the burial. Forever. Those words had meant everything to Margaret. She had no children of her own. Her parents had passed away years earlier. David's family was all she had left, and she clung to them desperately. They became her purpose, her reason to keep going. The requests for help started small. Marcus needed a few $100s for car repairs. Patricia's daughter needed school supplies. Margaret gave willingly, grateful to be needed. But over the years, the requests grew larger. Marcus's medical bills after a supposed workplace accident. Patricia's messy divorce that required a good lawyer. Elizabeth's old house that needed endless repairs. Margaret worked as a financial consultant at a prestigious firm. David had left her substantial life insurance policy, and she'd been smart with investments. She had money, and she shared it freely with his family. Every birthday, every holiday, every crisis, Margaret was there with her checkbook and her warm smile. Her co-workers noticed how tired she looked. Her best friend, Susan, gently suggested that perhaps she was being too generous, but Margaret couldn't hear it. This was how she kept David alive. Every time she helped his mother, every time she supported his brother, she felt connected to the man she'd loved. His family's gratitude filled the empty spaces in her heart. She remembered David's words from their last anniversary dinner, just 2 weeks before he died. "You have the biggest heart of anyone I know, Maggie, but promise me you'll save some of that love for yourself too." She'd laughed then, kissing him across the candlelit table. Now, standing alone in her kitchen with yet another bill. Those words felt like a prophecy she'd failed to honor. But surely David would understand. Surely he'd be proud of how she'd taken care of his family. Surely this was love, wasn't it? Margaret wrote the check, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in her purse. Tomorrow she'd drive it over to Elizabeth's house. She'd stay for tea, listen to stories about David's childhood, and feel like she still belonged to something bigger than her loneliness. She had no idea that tomorrow would be the beginning of the end. The next morning, Margaret pulled into Elizabeth's driveway with the check burning a hole in her purse. The house looked beautiful: fresh paint, new windows. The landscaping she'd paid for last spring. Pride mixed with something else in her chest, something she couldn't quite name. Was it resentment? No, she pushed the thought away. This was family. Elizabeth greeted her at the door with a tight smile. "Margaret, "Darling, come in, come in." Something felt different. Elizabeth's warmth seemed forced, mechanical, Margaret noticed. Her mother-in-law glancing repeatedly at the clock on the wall. In 8 years, Elizabeth had never seemed eager for her to leave. "I brought the check for the renovation," Margaret said, pulling it from her purse. "Oh, wonderful. Just leave it on the table." Elizabeth barely looked at it. "Actually, dear, I have a hair appointment in 20 minutes. I completely forgot." Margaret felt the sting of dismissal but smiled anyway. "Of course, I'll just use the restroom before I go." Walking down the familiar hallway, Margaret heard Elizabeth's voice on the phone in the kitchen. The words stopped her cold. "Yes, she just dropped off another check." I know. I felt terrible too, but what choice do I have? You know how Patricia is. Well, Marcus isn't any better. No, she has no idea. Why would she? We've been so careful. Next month I'll tell her I need a new roof. That should be good for at least 15,000. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might break. Through her ribs, she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The woman in the kitchen, laughing softly about manipulating her. Couldn't be the mother-in-law who'd held her at David's funeral. It couldn't be. She forced herself to walk to the bathroom, close the door, and turn on the faucet. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror, a 50-year-old woman who suddenly looked ancient. Her hands shook as she gripped the sink. Think, Margaret. Think clearly. She waited a few minutes, steadied her breathing, then walked back, out with a bright smile plastered on her face. "Have a wonderful appointment, Elizabeth. Call me if you need anything." The drive home was a blur. Margaret's mind raced through 8 years of memories, replaying them with new eyes. Marcus's workplace accident, had that even happened? Patricia's expensive divorce lawyer, had she really needed one? Or had it been an excuse? The endless home repairs, the medical bills, the tuition payments, how much of it had been real? She spent the rest of the day pulling out files, receipts, bank statements. Numbers swam before her eyes. $73,000 in the first year, $92,000 in the second. The totals climbed higher and higher. By dinner time, she'd calculated that she'd given David's family over $600,000 since his death. $600,000. Her phone rang. Patricia's name flashed on the screen. Margaret stared at it until it stopped ringing. Then it rang again. Marcus this time. She turned off her phone. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat in David's old armchair, the one she'd kept in the corner of their bedroom, and did something she hadn't done in years. She let herself get angry. Not sad, not grief-stricken, but furious. The rage built in her chest like a living thing, hot and sharp and cleansing. By morning, she'd made a decision. She would find out the truth, all of it, every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal, and then she would make them answer for it. But first, she needed proof. Margaret sat across from Susan at their favorite cafe, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. Her best friend studied her with concerned eyes. "I need your help," Margaret said quietly, "and I need you not to judge me for how blind I've been." Susan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Tell me everything for the next hour." Margaret laid it all out. Susan's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to outrage. When Margaret finished, Susan sat back in her chair, shaking her head. "We're hiring a private investigator," Susan said firmly. "My cousin's husband is one. He's discreet and thorough." "I don't know if I can afford," Margaret started, then stopped herself. The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of them. She'd given away over $500,000 to liars. But now she was worried about the cost of finding the truth. Within 2 days, Margaret was sitting in a small office across from Robert Chen, no relation. He'd joked, trying to lighten the mood. He was a stocky man in his 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Chen, Robert said, reviewing her notes. This kind of family exploitation is more common than you'd think. But the scale here is significant. I'll need about 2 weeks to compile a complete picture. Margaret gave him photos, addresses, and everything she knew about David's family. Then she went home and did the hardest thing she'd ever done. She pretended everything was normal. When Patricia called asking for money to fix her car, Margaret said yes. When Marcus texted about needing help with rent, she transferred the funds. When Elizabeth invited her for Sunday dinner, she showed up with flowers and a smile. Every interaction felt like swallowing glass, but she maintained her composure. She couldn't let them know she suspected anything. At work, she threw herself into her clients' portfolios with renewed focus. Her colleagues commented on her energy. If only they knew it was fueled by barely contained rage and a desperate need for distraction. The investigation uncovered details that made Margaret physically ill. Marcus's workplace accident, it never happened. The private investigator found him working at the same factory, completely healthy, no injury on record. Patricia's expensive divorce. She'd never even been married. The man she'd claimed was her ex-husband was actually her boyfriend. Very much still in her life, living in a condo that Margaret had unknowingly helped purchase. The medical bills Margaret had paid for Elizabeth's supposed heart condition. The hospital had no record of her as a patient. The receipts had been fabricated, professional-looking, but fake. Robert laid out surveillance photos on his desk. There was Marcus at a casino, betting heavily. Patricia shopping on Fifth Avenue with designer bags on both arms. Elizabeth at a luxury spa, getting treatments that cost more than most people's monthly salary. They've been living well off your generosity, Robert said gently. Very well. But the worst discovery came in week 2. Robert placed a folder in front of Margaret with unusual hesitation. Mrs. Chen, before you open this, I want you to know that I verified this information 3 times. I'm absolutely certain. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, property records, and a series of emails. Her vision blurred as she read them. Then sharpened with crystalline clarity. David's life insurance hadn't been the only money. There had been a substantial inheritance from his grandmother that he'd never told Margaret about. $3 million, held in a trust that had passed to his family upon his death. They'd received it within 6 months of his funeral. They had never needed her money. Not once, not ever. Margaret looked up at Robert, and for the first time since David's death, she felt something inside her break completely. Not her heart that had broken when he died. This was different. This was the breaking of chains she hadn't known were binding her. What do you want to do? Robert asked quietly. Margaret closed the folder and stood up. Her voice was steady, cold and certain. I want justice. Margaret planned everything with the precision she brought to her financial work. She wouldn't confront them separately where they could coordinate their lies. She wouldn't give them time to prepare excuses. She would bring them all together and watch their carefully constructed lies collapse. She called each of them, her voice sweet as honey. I'm hosting a family dinner on Saturday, 7 o'clock. It's important I have something wonderful to share with all of you. They all agreed eagerly. Of course they did. They probably thought she was about to announce another generous gift. Saturday evening arrived. Margaret had transformed her dining room into something elegant and formal. Her best china, fresh flowers, candles flickering on the table. To anyone else, it would look like a celebration. To Margaret, it was a courtroom. Elizabeth arrived first. Dressed expensively in clothes Margaret had probably paid for without knowing it. Patricia came next with her boyfriend, Tom, the man Margaret had believed was her ex-husband. Marcus showed up last, looking nervous. He'd always been the weakest link. This is lovely, dear, Elizabeth said, surveying the table. What's the special occasion? Let's eat first, Margaret smiled. Then we'll talk. She'd catered the meal from David's favourite restaurant. As they ate, they chatted about nothing, the weather. Local news, safe topics. Margaret watched them. Really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in years. They were strangers wearing familiar faces. When dessert was cleared, Margaret stood. She walked to the sideboard and retrieved a thick folder, Robert's investigation. Her hands were perfectly steady. 8 years ago, my husband died, she began. And you all became my family. The only family I had left. I loved you because David loved you. I helped you because I thought that's what David would have wanted. Patricia smiled warmly. And we've always been so grateful. I paid over $600,000 to this family since David's death, Margaret continued, her voice cutting through Patricia's words like a knife. $73,000 the first year alone, medical bills, legal fees, home repairs, tuition, living expenses. I gave and gave and gave. The room had gone very quiet. Marcus's fork clattered against his plate. But here's what I learned recently. Margaret opened the folder. Marcus, you never had a workplace accident, did you? You've worked at the same factory for 12 years with a perfect health record. Those medical bills you sent me. Fabricated. Marcus's face drained of colour. Margaret. I can explain. Patricia. Margaret turned to her. You were never married to Tom, so there was no divorce, no expensive lawyer. That $50,000 I gave you, where did it actually go? Patricia's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Elizabeth. Margaret's voice hardened as she faced her mother-in-law. Your heart condition, the one that required so much expensive treatment. The hospital has no record of you ever being a patient there. Your receipts were fake. Now wait just a minute. Elizabeth started to rise. Sit down. The command in Margaret's voice surprised even her. Elizabeth sat. But the real masterpiece, Margaret continued, pulling out another set of documents, was convincing me you needed my help at all. David's grandmother left him $3 million in a trust. When he died, it passed to his family. You received it 8 months after his funeral. You've been millionaires this entire time. The silence was deafening. So let me ask you, Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Why? You didn't need my money. Why take it? For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Elizabeth laughed. Cold, bitter sound that made Margaret's skin crawl. Because you made it so easy, Elizabeth said. You were so desperate to belong, so pathetically grateful for any scrap of attention. David always said you were too soft, too trusting. He was right. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. David said that, oh, honey, Patricia joined in, emboldened by her mother's cruelty. David complained about you constantly. How clingy you were, how needy. We were doing you a favour, really, giving you purpose. Margaret looked at Marcus, hoping for something different from him. But he couldn't meet her eyes. Get out, Margaret said quietly. What? Elizabeth blinked. Get out of my house. The roar that came from Margaret surprised them all of you, now. They scrambled for the door. As Elizabeth passed, she hissed. You'll regret this. We're family. No, Margaret said. You never were. The door slammed. Margaret stood alone in her dining room, surrounded by the ruins of her beautiful table, and felt something unexpected. Not pain, not even anger anymore. Freedom. The days after the confrontation blurred together. Margaret threw herself into action with singular focus. She met with lawyers, accountants, and began exploring every legal option available. The family had committed fraud, forged medical documents, fabricated invoices, false pretenses. Her attorney was optimistic about recovering at least some of the money, but something Elizabeth had said haunted Margaret. David always said you were too soft, too trusting. Had her husband really felt that way? The David she remembered had Being loving, attentive, proud of her kindness. But what if she'd been wrong about him too? What if 8 years of grief had turned him into a saint in her memory when the reality had been different? Unable to sleep, Margaret found herself in their home office at 3 in the morning, opening boxes she'd sealed after David's death, his personal papers, journals. Old files, things she'd been too heartbroken to sort through. Now she needed to know the truth, all of it. She found the first journal in a box labeled David, personal, his handwriting sprawled across the pages, familiar and painful. She almost closed it. But she needed to know. The early entries were mundane work frustrations, weekend plans, thoughts about their marriage. Margaret smiled sadly at an entry from their 5th anniversary. Took Maggie to the coast today. Watched her face light up at sunset. How did I get so lucky? But as she read further, the entries changed. Complaints started appearing. Small at first, she worked too much. She was too focused on her career. Then they grew sharper, more bitter, sometimes. I feel like I married a robot, not a woman. She can calculate compound interest, but can't understand why I need more than her spreadsheets and schedules. Margaret felt the words like cuts. She kept reading, unable to stop. Saw Mom today. She asked again why we don't have kids. How do I tell her that Margaret chose her career over a family? That she's married to her job, not to me? Margaret's hand shook. They'd both agreed to wait on children. It had been a mutual decision, hadn't it? Then she found an entry dated 1 month before his death that made her blood run cold. I've started the process. I can't do this anymore. Margaret is a good person. But we're wrong for each other. We've been wrong from the start. My family sees it. They've always seen it. Mom said I should have married someone warmer, someone who actually needs me. She's right. The divorce papers should arrive next week. I'll tell Margaret on Friday. God, I'm dreading it, but it has to be done. I deserve to be happy. The journal slipped from Margaret's hands. Divorce papers. David had wanted a divorce. He'd died before he could tell her. Margaret sat on the floor of the office as dawn broke outside, surrounded by the ghosts of lies. Her perfect marriage had been a fiction. David had been unhappy, influenced by his toxic family, planning to leave her, and she'd spent 8 years mourning a relationship that had already been dead. But then something else caught her eye. Locked metal box in the back of the cabinet. She'd noticed it years ago, but never had the key. Now, driven by a need to know everything, she pried it open with a letter opener. Inside were more papers, legal documents, and as Margaret read them, her understanding of everything shifted one final, devastating time. David's life insurance policy, the one she'd thought was $2 million, had originally been for $5 million. Someone had changed the beneficiary amount, and there, in the paperwork, was a forged signature, her signature, transferring $3 million of her own benefit to his family trust. The forgery was crude, obvious to anyone who looked, but she'd never looked. She trusted the lawyer at the reading of the will, a lawyer who she now noticed was Elizabeth's personal attorney. They hadn't just manipulated her after David's death, they'd stolen from her before she even knew she was being robbed, and David might have been part of it. The dates on the documents were from 2 weeks before. He died, right when he was planning to ask for a divorce. Had he known, had this been his parting gift to a family who'd convinced him his wife wasn't good enough? Margaret sat among the papers as morning light filled the room, and she made a decision. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about reclaiming her entire life from people who tried to destroy it. She picked up her phone and called Robert. I need you to dig deeper. I need to know everything about David, about his family. About all of it. Whatever it costs. Margaret, Robert's voice was gentle. Are you sure? Some truths are. I'm sure, she said firmly. No more lies, not ever again. 3 months later. Margaret stood in a courtroom wearing a navy suit that made her feel powerful. Across the room, Elizabeth, Patricia, and Marcus sat with their lawyer, looking significantly less confident than they had at that disastrous family dinner. Robert's investigation had uncovered everything: the forged insurance documents, the fake medical records, the fabricated divorce papers. The coordinated scheme that had started even before David's death. Most damning of all evidence that David's sudden heart attack might not have been as sudden as everyone believed. The autopsy had been cursory, ruling natural causes. But when Margaret had it reviewed by an independent expert, something troubling emerged. The levels of certain medications in David's system had been unusually high, medications he'd been taking for blood pressure, prescribed by a doctor who turned out to be a friend of Elizabeth's. Margaret's lawyer hadn't pursued murder charges. The evidence was circumstantial, the time passed too long, but it was enough to make the family desperate to settle. They knew what a full trial would reveal. They knew what the public would think. The settlement was brutal. Margaret recovered every penny she'd given them, plus damages. The family was required to return the $3 million from the forged insurance transfer. They would face fraud charges unless they agreed to a permanent restraining order. They could never contact Margaret again. But money wasn't the victory Margaret savored as she walked out of that courtroom. The real victory was the woman she'd become. After the legal proceedings concluded, Margaret made changes. She sold the house she'd shared with David. Too many ghosts, too many lies. She bought a smaller condo downtown with a view of the river. She started therapy to unpack 8 years of manipulation and a marriage she'd misunderstood. She reconnected with old friends she'd neglected while pouring all her energy into David's family. She traveled to places she'd always wanted to see but David had dismissed as boring. She discovered she loved hiking, something her husband had mocked. She took cooking classes, joined a book club, started volunteering at a women's shelter. At work, she was promoted to senior partner, her focus and strategic thinking sharper than ever. Her colleagues remarked on the change in her, a new confidence, a strength that hadn't been there before. 6 months after the settlement, Susan met her for coffee at their favorite cafe. "You look different," Susan said, studying her friend. "Good different. I feel different," Margaret admitted, lighter somehow. "Like I've been carrying around weights I didn't know were there, and someone finally cut them loose." "Any regrets?" Susan asked carefully. Margaret considered the question. Did she regret the 8 years she'd lost, the money she'd given, the trust she'd placed in people who didn't deserve it? "No," she said finally, "because it taught me the most important lesson of my life. I don't need anyone to complete me. I don't need to earn love through generosity or sacrifice. I am enough. Exactly as I am." She pulled out her phone and showed Susan a photo. Margaret standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, arms spread wide, face tilted to the sun. She'd taken that trip alone last month, something the old Margaret would never have done. "I spent so long trying to honor David's memory by taking care of his family. But David didn't deserve that honor, and his family certainly didn't deserve my love." Margaret's voice was strong, clear. "The person who deserved care and love and generosity was me. And I finally figured that out." That evening, Margaret sat on her condo balcony, watching the sun set over the river. Her phone buzzed with a message from the women's shelter where she volunteered. A woman she'd been mentoring, someone who'd escaped an abusive relationship, had just signed a lease on her first apartment. The message ended with a simple line: "Thank you for showing me what strength looks like." Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. She'd spent 50 years learning to value herself through others' eyes. It had taken a devastating betrayal to teach her to see her own worth. She thought about David sometimes, but without the rose-colored glasses of grief. He'd been a flawed man who'd chosen his toxic family over a wife who'd loved him. That was his loss, his failure. Not hers. She thought about Elizabeth, Patricia, and Marcus, too, wondering if they'd learned anything, if they felt any remorse. But mostly, she didn't think about them at all. They'd taken 8 years of her life. But they wouldn't get another minute. As darkness fell and lights began twinkling across the city, Margaret raised a glass of wine to herself, to survival, to strength, to the truth that had set her free. She was 50 years old. And her life was finally, truly, her own, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. Sometimes the greatest betrayal teaches us the greatest truth, that the only approval we need is our own. And the only family worth having is the one we choose, starting with ourselves.